Hello, Avila Advantage microeconomics students. We are close to three-fourths of the week done with the course. So after week 6, as again, these courses move so quickly when they're online. So just stay on top of things and you'll do fine. This week, continue with your weekly quiz, your homework. We will look at 2 chapters this week. We look at chapter 11 and chapter 12. I'm going to keep the video lecture a little bit brief this week, but I just want to highlight some of the topics that you're going to be reading about. And then we're going to have a forum discussion tied directly to the Flint, Michigan water crisis because it's relevant. It's all about negative externalities. It engages in critical thinking about how things went wrong, why it went wrong, how this is a good example of market failure. And you got to remember, negative externalities is something that some party does that impacts another party. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to chapter 12. But this is where we have to really put our heads together and think about, what is best and how do we prevent this in the future. It's all about allocating resources and doing the right thing. So, all right, first with chapter 11, we look at chapter 11, it talks about mergers. This is kind of a continuation of our market structures. In the United States, we do want to promote competition. That's the Justice Department's job, their antitrust division. And a lot of the early history of this in the business of the United States, you got to remember that business historically has not been around that long, at least in this form. I mean, you can go back to the early traders in the 14th and 15th century, but organized business as we see in the United States is still a relatively new thing. And a lot of it evolved out from the early 1900s or late 1800s. It actually was John Rockefeller and Standard Oil, in which at one point he controlled about 90% of the world oil supply. In fact, if you were back in macroeconomics, John Rockefeller, adjusted for inflation, was the wealthiest person ever to live. So if you're going back to how much he made back in that time period to today's prices, it far surpasses any Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. So the United States government went after Rockefeller and the oil industry and broke it up. And even after they broke it up, he still was one of the wealthiest men ever to live because he still owned the majority of all those resources. So even when they tried to punish him, it still just made him wealthier. So, but out of that was a lot of different laws: the Sherman antitrust law, the fair trade laws, anything that they felt that was kind of like a tie-in or lock-in that prevented competition. It was now the Justice Department job to make sure that markets are competitive. And some of the things that we look at in this chapter to see whether markets are competitive can be like a concentration ratio, like the 4-firm concentration ratio looks at the market share in terms of sales for the top 4 firms. If you look at the breakfast cereal industry, you have Quaker, Post, Kellogg's, General Mills. They probably control about 80 to 85% of the cereal market. Now, just because there is a very high 4-firm concentration ratio doesn't mean that the United States government is going to go in and try to break up the cereal industry. There are some industries, just because of economies of scale, that may be oligopolistic in nature, that are still competitive in their viewpoint. The other thing they could also look at is a Herfindahl index, and essentially what you're doing, if there were 10 firms that own 10% of the industry, you would take 10 squared plus 10 squared and repeat that, and you get up to 1,000. And generally, if the number's above 1,800, it's kind of a red flag for those in the Justice Department. It doesn't mean they're going to do anything, but when companies are considering mergers, whether they would kind of cooperate and work together, they're going to look at that number to say, hey, is it still competitive enough? Is this something that we can live with and agree with? So with this, what you're going to read about in this chapter is about some restrictive policies. Can you prevention of bundling or tie-in pricing, excludability, minimum resale pricing. You're going to look at regulations of natural monopolies, like locally Great Plains Energy, KCP&L is a natural monopoly. They go before regulatory boards to ask for rate increases, and they're allowed to earn what we call a normal profit, but they cannot gouge consumers, and because there's no competition, and essentially they have to make sure that they're in check. And then they wrap the end of this chapter with deregulation. So, in markets, economists vary in their opinions about how much regulation there should be. If you're kind of a rational economist, you would say that there should be almost very little regulation. Markets will regulate themselves. But as we've seen from the crisis with the subprime crisis and kind of the result of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act after some of the accounting scandals with Enron, there probably needs to be some regulation. But regulation does bring on a lot of cost. I'm in higher education. We have a lot of regulation in higher education. That's one of the reasons that college tuition has skyrocketed, is because of the increased regulation at the federal level. So it's a balance, so it's a question of how much regulation is good for the economy. If there's too much, it can create a burden. We talk about marginal benefits, marginal costs. So the marginal costs can start to get very high. But maybe we need to have certain types of regulations in place because we can't allow the subprime crisis to happen again. We can't allow the economy to get to that point where it's on the brink of disaster. So, all right, chapter 12. We're going to focus on the negative externalities this week. So, a negative externality is anything that you do or a party does that the other party has to experience that bad experience even though they've done nothing themselves. I'll give you a simplified example. If I, at my house, leave pink flamingos all over the yard, I never mow the lawn, I have the car on cinder blocks, and I never paint the house, my neighbors hate me. Okay, even though they have done nothing, it's because I have done something that's impacted them. It's impacted the value of their neighborhood. Just with the Flint, Michigan, with the water pollution, nothing was done about the lead, nothing was done to correct the problem. Many people had to experience the bad water. Some of them got sick or could have potential lead poisoning. So there was a market failure. The market didn't correctly allocate the way things should be, and that's often when the government has to intervene and try to reduce these negative externalities. Okay, so that's a lot of what this chapter's discussion is about. And also we have pollution as a big one. There's more and more people in the world. There's greater environmental concerns. I have some colleagues right now that just went over to China, and they literally have to wear an air mask every day. So it's kind of, we ask the question, must we foul our own nest? We all live on this planet together, and as we grow with greater GDPs, more people in the world wanting more resources, there are going to be negative externalities. So how do we preserve our planet? How do we preserve our resources? And how do we all live together? And those are tough economic questions. But this chapter attempts to look at some of these main concepts and, what are some ways that we can correct some of these problems so we can live better together. They mentioned some tactics. They have what are called controlled tactics, where it just says you cannot pollute, or you can only put so much glop in the river. The other ones might be market incentives, where you're taxed. Often the EPA will tax electric companies if they put too much pollution in the environment, or they may give them the market rights to pollute so much, and that way it kind of gives them an incentive to reduce their pollution so they can sell that permit to another company that needs to pollute. So it becomes an economic incentive to reduce pollution. And a lot of economists are in favor of the market approach. In terms of the explicit cost, implicit cost, again, we can only reduce pollution so much. So if, one of the hot topics right now is obviously in a political topic, areas of West Virginia and coal mining regions, there has been a push to reduce coal production. And the idea is that coal is very dirty, contributes a lot to the pollution in the environment. Can there be better alternative resources to produce energy? Of course, this can also have impacts of jobs. So we have to look at, marginal benefits versus marginal cost again. Or if I implement some policy, there's probably some policy to administer this, project or cost. I'll give you recycling as an example. Most cities have recycling of some form, but it does require a lot of time and effort and money and energy to do a recycling program. I know where I live at Lee Summit, they would sponsor areas around the city, but I think they backed off of that a little bit, and it's kind of dependent on you to pay your trash vendor to do the recycling. There's no law that says that I can't just put my recycling in with the trash. It could be thrown away in a landfill somewhere, but those things are hard to measure. So we have to put values on those things, and we have to determine how important it is to us or how much money we're willing to spend to make sure that we have a cleaner environment. You're going to look at some charts there to kind of show marginal benefits, marginal cost, and there's some point that ideally that this is the quantity that I would devote in energy and effort to make sure that we have a better environment. And then finally, just from an international perspective, I just mentioned earlier that with China, we have to face the reality that we have limited resources, and there's air pollution, water pollution, land pollution. So if we're going to have viable land in the future, we're going to have to work in some type of cooperative behavior to make sure that we have available space, green space available. The textbook even mentions, the benefit of that. I've taken my family on vacations to national parks, seeing the beauty of national parks. But as we grow and grow and grow, and we have more people getting into areas that they didn't live before, a lot of that is going to be disappearing. That's hard to replace and bring that back. It can come back over a period of time, but once, cities get established, there's less space available for those resources. So it's just tough questions that we have to ask. And it may even be population questions that we have to ask too. Have we reached that capacity on our planet? We already have about 4 billion people that live in poverty. Is there a better way to do things? So these are some tough economic questions, but they're interesting questions to discuss. So that's it for this week, but I want you to have a great week. I'm looking forward to the forward discussion. If you have any questions, do email me, and I will talk to you online. Take care.